Berg.
Oh, welcome everyone to this African Awareness Liberation Day. Today is officially the 25th of May, and it is the actual Africa Day. So I would like to welcome you to the final online mini-series on Pan-Afrikanism and climate change. So this is a partnership between African Voices Forum, XR Bristol, XR International Solidarity Network, and yeah, those three. My name is Penina Achen-Kindberg. I am currently the board advisor for African Voices Forum. I am also the chair for the Bristol link with Beira, which is a twinning link that was developed 30 years ago with Mozambique. I will be co-chairing this session along with my colleague Donna Pinnock and our friend. So tonight our conversation weaves through three different stories with the voices of women from Bristol taking the lead in driving environmental sustainability and decolonization of the education system underpinned by the principles of Pan-Afrikanism. However, before we get into the conversation, I would like to introduce Cabo Hugh Ferdinand from Lyrically Justified for a Dose of Spoken Word. Welcome, Cabo.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I feel honored to be here. Thank you for having considered me in this moment to be a value contributing member of this community. So thank you. The first piece I'll share with you is called Love in All Its Hues. Love in all its hues, our only hope. If love's our only hope, let the fluids flow. Justice. There's none to be found in this civilized world of illusion. We're living a lie that is the accepted norm. Equality, a myth. To be liberals equates to the exploitation of 99.9% of us in every way. Love in all its hues, our only hope. If love's our only hope, let the fluids flow. In the shadow of labor's love letter, in the waxing and waning of the moon, may it ignite that which we need, that which we seek, that which we've been crying for in thousands of years. May it be ignited in the lap of the bearer. May it be what she chooses it to be. Gentle, caring, loving, rough. Let it be her choice, as variable as the desires of the beholders forever caught in the rapturous yearning for her embrace. In the good times filled with pain, as karma's counterbalance maintains equilibrium, as all which lives dies, as a sacrifice fertilizing life. Love in all its hues, our only hope. If love's our only hope, let the fluids flow. Love in all its hues, our only hope. If love's our only hope, bless, honor the fluids, the life-giving source of each and every being. As I breathe, as I desire, as I long, as I yearn, as I need this ever ending, never ending urge to be. I know none of it matters without you. Love in all its hues, our only hope. If love's our only hope, let the fluids flow. So that's love in all its hues. The next piece is a bit of a follow-on from it, and it's called I Bow. I bow. Goddess, whom being, I bow at your feet in heart, in mind, in spirit, in action, as the earth feeds all needs. A thought in honor of suffering, hope bleeds eternal. In your eyes burns life and more life as the mystics return. May the witch find a way. May the crazy, may the freak be honored in this day. Realize liberty's love letter to equality as justice seeks each generation to manifest us in motion. I'm rather excited by the anxiety of the evolving being as you emanate. Whom being is this possible if the story of you is told, yet she'll be back. She'll forgive them. She'll love them because they come from her. Promising to return to me as I bow. May I find my balance in harmony, whilst not suppressing disharmony, for seeing and finding the balance. As I bow internally, grateful for life, I give thanks to you, being, goddess, whom, portal of all that is. Without you, there's nothing. One love. I bow. So that's I think that should be my time.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much, Kabo. That's a really, really very powerful words. I mean, two things that stuck out for me. The one thing that came out from your first one was life-giving soul of every living being. And the second one was the goddess and the disharmony in seeking the balance. Those are really, really strong words and really, really powerful. Thank you very much, Kabo, for sharing that with us. And I think it will set the scene. It will set the scene as we move through our conversation today, where this incredibly powerful panel, who are women who will also share their own stories, their own experiences in their areas of expertise, and also in just being mothers and women. So before we move on to the conversation, I would like to give a little bit of a background on the African Liberation Awareness Day. So African Liberation Awareness Day is a global event that is held on the 25th of May to commemorate and reaffirm our commitment to Pan-Afrikanism and the total liberation and unification of Africa. In the first series of these events, I mentioned that this is the third series. Our speakers clearly articulated the principles that have informed the Pan-African ideology and the link to making increasing victories against capitalism, neocolonialism, racism, and ecocide. We also talked about the various forms of resistance and how they've been used in Africa and beyond. The second session, which was the youth session, we further explored what action or the role of young people young people can take towards realizing or driving the planet repairs agenda, as we are acutely aware that we are facing a climate crisis. Many experts point to 1988 as a critical turning point when watershed events placed global warming in the spotlight. The impact of climate change has been far worse in the global south. Specifically in Africa, it has manifested in various forms: epidemics, endemic diseases, drought, floods, agricultural pests, and bushfires. But some areas are also susceptible to earthquakes, cyclones, and volcanic eruptions. We saw this recently in East Africa, where there has been a locust infestation. When heavy rains come in to saturate the desert, locusts breed like mad. And also in last year, we saw Cyclone Idai, which was in Beira, which claimed almost 90% of the city and just under 1,000 lives. The projections are grimmer if we go by the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the IPCC, at 1.5 degrees. So today we continue our talk by hearing from women who are active not just within the climate justice arena, but also within the education sector. We have talked about decolonizing the education systems that have contributed towards things like Afrophobia and the continuing maangamizi. Maangamizi is a Swahili word for harm. Our youth panel shared some of their experiences last week, which have left some lasting images in my mind. And when I talk about Afrophobia, this also means that it is the fear of anything African. So before further ado, I would like to introduce my guest speakers for tonight. So my first speaker, I introduce Sophia McKenzie. Sophia has over 30 years experience as an educationist in both primary and secondary schools. She is committed to the providing and ensuring of equity and equality in and out of the educational settings. She's also a community activist and a campaigner for social justice. She is very passionate about educating and empowering Black women. We will hear more about her experiences in the session, but I'd like Sophia to just give a wave. Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce Tess Humble. Tess has worked with refugees for over 10 years and has been a climate change campaigner for almost 10 years, which is a similar time. She's currently involved with the global border security agenda and its threat to migrants, including climate migrants. Tess is a trustee of Project Mama, which provides maternity support for refugees, asylum seekers, and refugees. She was formerly a director of Eastern, based at Charity Borderlands, supporting refugees and asylum seekers. She has worked with refugees in the UK, Turkey, and Germany, and has set up several projects, including life jackets for refugees. Tess presented at TEDx talk called Dismantling the Border Security Mantra. She has also co-authored 2 chapters on border security, climate change, and migration, and has been published by outlets such as the Open Democracy and Forced Migration Review. Tess, if you give us a wave. Thank you. Finally, I would like to introduce Zakiya McKenzie. Zakiya is a PhD student at the University of Exeter, whose research explores literary archives to better understand Black British journalism in post-empire Windrush Britain. Zakiya is also a volunteer at Ujima 98 FM and a Green and Black ambassador. She's tasked with closing the gap between African Caribbean Bristolians and the city's environmental sector. In 2019, she was chosen as a writer in residence for the Forestry Commission to celebrate its centenary. She writes about her experience as a woman in the forest of climate change, memory, and otherness. So those are our 3 main speakers. Who also co-hosting with me tonight is Donna Pinnock. Donna has been a great friend, and she's also a colleague. Donna is a trustee for African Voices Forum, and at some point she will pick up the co-hosting. So I will take 2 minutes there to give everyone a breather before we start the next session. Right, so we'll just start our conversation. And our conversation starts with Tessa. Tess, not Tessa, sorry. Tess,
Right.
you have worked quite a bit on the border security space. Can you give us a sense of the link between this and the neo-colonializing agenda focusing on the African continent?
Certainly, Penina. Thank you for the question. And I also feel very privileged to be here talking on these really important topics and with these amazing individual organizations. So thank you. So to address this question, I'm going to bring it back a bit to look at the larger context. You cannot understand border security without looking at the roots of how borders were formed and the oppression of colonialization. So as most of us know, over the last 500 years, Africa has been subjected to the pillaging of resources and wealth, the stealing and sale of its people through the slave trade in millions, the commodification and destruction and depletion of its lands and nature, as well as the stealing of culture, of systems of organizing, languages, worldview, and even, I suppose, the very sense of purpose and what it means to be alive in a community, in an indigenous community. So there's been a huge amount of violence put upon the people of Africa and the stealing of, I suppose, essentially dignity as well as the means to live. And then Europe in 1985 carved up Africa like it was a bit of meat into countries, and that's in doing so they didn't at all take into account the local needs or even the desire to have these abstract borders. And neo-colonialism has resulted in this ongoing abuse and oppression and the controlling of African people and their lands, through large land grabs, unsustainable farming, overfishing. And this, this doesn't even touch on the large debt owed to international banks and the continued control of how African states run their politics and their economies and their societies. And through this sense of ownership and destruction of nature as well, we're of course seeing climate change. And Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to climate change. I won't go into that too much because I assume the audience is quite tuned into this. But this is due to climate extremes that already exist, but also poverty levels and abilities to adapt that often tie back to the reasons I just spoke about or the issues that I just spoke about. So coming to, I suppose, migration and borders, migration is not an inevitable part of climate change. It's the social, economic and political situations that already exist around about it. It's essentially the ability to adapt, the infrastructure, the governance, the different options and so on. It is an amplifier of pre-existing pressures. But this is, of course, up to a certain temperature and at certain extremes, people cannot live and will look to escape unbearable situations. But that's except for the most vulnerable, the most poor who do not have the resources to leave. And we're already seeing, such as in Burkina Faso, when there has been recent extreme droughts, less people migrate. So the really poorest are stuck and will suffer the most extreme impacts from climate change. So, I mean, across West Africa and other regions, we're seeing seasonal migration for work becoming permanent due to changing and lessening rains. People are losing their villages are losing their people. Around about Lake Chad, 90% of the water is gone, and this is due to climate change and bad management. And this interplayed with ongoing conflict in the region has left millions displaced. And then you mentioned the cyclone Ida before, Penina, as that combined with Cyclone Kenneth that hit a couple of weeks later, this saw 2.2 million people displaced in the area. And there's been other great storms and flash floods in recent years that's also seen huge displacement that we've not seen in the news. And within this, the EU and the US in particular is looking to continue to control and oppress the people of Africa through border security. They're looking to force African states to adopt the view that the migrant is a criminal and to get them to close their borders that the EU drew up without consent from African people in the 1980s. In Africa alone, the EU has identified 35 countries which they deem as priority for enhancing border management. And this takes under a scheme called the EU's Global Approach to Migration and Mobility. And there's two kind of main processes in Africa. I'm not going to go to the details of the border securitization process because it is quite dry, but I will talk about the impacts of them. So in West Africa, you have the Rabat process, so this is a process to increase border management, and this spans from Central African Republic to Benin to Mali to Senegal, so right across West Africa. And in fact, Nigeria has been dubbed by Europe to the new European border, so the sense of ownership is quite incredible there. And in the Horn of Africa, this is covered by the Khartoum process, and this spans 11 countries all the way from Tunisia in the north right down to Kenya. And I think this is 4,000 miles in difference, so they're trying to control the border landscape there as well. And in North Africa, there's also an interest in border security in its own right. And these border security programs, what this means in practice, they range greatly, but they're generally around about developing local security, border security guards through training, to technical support, and provision of equipment like surveillance to even weapons. And really perversely, the West has been using indigenous groups to help close borders. For example, in Italy a few years back, the Italian government had a meeting with 60 tribal chiefs from across North Africa to ask for their cooperation to prevent cross-border movement. And this is obviously for financial aid and return. So there's huge amounts of manipulation there. And we need to understand that, of course, in Africa, like every part in the world, migration is seen as a normal thing, positive thing, actually. In West Africa, you have the economic community of West African states, and that allows citizens of these nations the right to move, to employment, to trade, to residency. It's seen as a benefit for all. And now the EU has border security as a central priority in all country relationships and agreements, which has not been mutually agreed by both parties, of course, but it's a decision by the EU. So if African counterparts do not agree to the full conditions of these country agreements, then they do not get the benefits that come with these agreements, such as trades, being part of international agreements, or even aid. So it's hugely detrimental to say no to this overall package. And it's coercion, essentially, it's blackmail. And the really damaging thing that exports the idea that migrants are criminals, you know, that is nomads or workers or refugees, people who've been moving in these lands since mankind was born 200,000 years ago. So it's a legalized and normal movement for livelihood, movement for survival, movement for, excuse me, for ethnic, tribal reasons, whatever. And essentially it is deeply controlling, and it's deeply racist, because ultimately this is an attempt to control movement into Europe, of course. It is an attempt to control the people who Europe does not deem as worthy and does not want up to allow into their countries. And this is the black and the brown people of this world. And of course, it doesn't take into the local needs to migrate locally. And at the same time, it also doesn't take into account that many who might be escaping poverty and going to where the wealth has ended up in Europe and America as well. It doesn't take into account that they might be escaping to the lands who robbed their country of their wealth and resources in the first place. So this is, I suppose, the landscape that border securitization is going on with Africa at the minute. It's a global agenda by the West. And this prevention of movement in a warming world, an increasing hostile world, could be hugely perilous and even deadly for many Africans. And I also find it very worrying that this is not higher up, I suppose, border security in particular, high up the activist agenda and higher up the human rights agenda at the minute.
Well, thank you, Sophie. That's very interesting. And I just picked up something that you said about the continued control. And I think you have alluded to it quite a few times. And Sophia, as an educationist, you have taught in primary and secondary schools. One of the key areas of discussion has been decolonizing of the education system to counter the indoctrination that has led to the current Maangamizi. Maangamizi, again, if I clarify that, is harm. We see our young people overrepresented in the criminal justice system. In Bristol, we are in the top 10 for fixed exclusions in the schools. And there's the notion of the schools to prison pipeline. Can you share your thoughts and experience on this, Sophia?
Okay, and again, thank you for having me here to take part in this discussion. I'm really honoured. I think to start with, the first thing I'd say is, clearly we all know that, like, the education system is essentially a Eurocentric education system. It does not address or represent the cultural society that our children and young people are growing up in and coming from, whether that's from the UK or coming into the UK as refugees. You know, it's my belief and lots of people's beliefs that young people have a right and an entitlement to learn and become knowledgeable about people that represent them, for people that are professional, that they can see themselves reflected in, and can relate to, that are relatable to them. The problem with our education system, as I said, is it is Eurocentric. It doesn't really allow for those things. We don't usually see in schools as much. I know in Bristol we have like the One Bristol curriculum that's coming out, which is a really good initiative, but that needs to be right across the UK, not just in Bristol. And it needs to represent, so children do need to see Black writers, scientists, professors, doctors, dentists, and not just in that little cluster of Black History Month. It needs to be spread right out across the education system, in my mind. I think quite often it's very difficult, and in my experience, it's quite difficult for young people when they are going into education and they're going into history lessons, and this starts from primary age right through to secondary age, but starting at primary age, and they're not learning about anything that they can relate to. They're not learning about anything that they can hold on to, that they can pull and say, okay, I can make a connection to that. It's a very white, as I said, Eurocentric education system. It's not, in this country, it seems to be like education is a one size fits all, if you like. That's not how it should be. So to decolonize the education system, we need to look about how we can use our voices to become more active in our children's education, how we can use our community to become more active in our communication, in our children's education, and how we can insist and not just accept what is basically in front of us. As regards to the prison, the pipeline to prison, which is particularly like, it's an American term that is coming over more into this country. Without a doubt, it doesn't mean that, children that are excluded, it doesn't mean that they are going to end up in prison. But there is a clear link between fixed term and permanent exclusions, particularly for Black youth in this country and children from Afro-Caribbean, African heritage backgrounds. And that's what's happening with those children when they become excluded from the education system. They become almost like detached. They come detached, so they lack sort of self-worth. They don't fit into society. They don't fit into education. If you become excluded, your chances are so much more reduced of you getting back into mainstream education. So those children are then educated in alternative provisions, pupil referral units, those sorts of things, and then they become further disassociated with society, which can, without a doubt, lead to criminality or vulnerability to criminality. It's not, like I said, it's not a definite correlation. It's not if this happens, that's going to happen, but it does increase that risk. And then we have to look at why children are being excluded. And we have to look at whether in the education system we're taking account of things like our cultural differences, the way of expression. So being misrepresented. So if I give you an example of Black girls, if they're loud and boys, then they may be deemed as aggressive. So maybe the educators have already got like a preconceived idea and a preconceived stereotype of how our young people are, when in actual fact, it's just part of their expression and they should be allowed that expression. It shouldn't be, this is how you have to be and you must fit within that box, especially when they're coming from homes where they are quite clearly able to express themselves. We then have the flip side of that, which kind of like touches on Tess's work and what Tess spoke about. And that is children that are maybe coming from refugee backgrounds, have seen harm, have experienced harm. They may not even actually have seen harm. We know it within our own Black community. We see and we know about intergenerational trauma. So, and how that can then affect and manifest in young people and the sorts of behaviours that may be exhibited. So we could have a young person that's suffering trauma, We could have a parent that's a refugee who's asylum seeker, maybe limited English, not knowing about the education system because it's wholly different in this country than it is in other countries. Not being able to
Sophia, can I bring in, I think what I wanted to do as well was I really want to capture the exhibits and how all of these things can manifest in our society today. But before I do that, let me bring in Zakiya. Zakiya, Sophia had just touched on the overrepresentation and how this actually manifests itself, not just in the school exclusions, but also we know that it has manifested in the criminal justice system. And Zakiya, you were chosen from about 1,000 applicants to write about woodland life for the Forestry Commission's centenary year. Can you tell us a bit about that and why you applied for it?
Sure. Thanks for having me as well. So I am a writer. I think generally I've been a writer for a very, very long time. And I suppose I've been writing about nature for as long as I've been writing without recognizing that what I was doing was nature writing, and it was a genre and there was a thing called nature writing. So I think I applied because I love writing and I love nature. So I put those things together and sent in an application actually very last minute, and I kind of sent in an application because I needed something to remind me that I could actually write. So I wouldn't say that I kind of went in expecting to be the writer, but I think I had no clue, I had no clue about this whole genre of nature writing that I am now a part of, and very, very much kind of the face in Black Britain of, in a way, in Britain, the face of nature writing amongst non-white people in the UK. So for me to actually try and find, so once I realized like, okay, I'm going to become a nature writer, or I'm going to be doing nature writing as a genre as it exists in Britain, I think the first thing I started to do was to look for writers that I could lean on. So who in the UK that was from a non-white background was writing, or from a working class background, who was writing that I could follow, learn from, and kind of just understand. Now I quickly found that in the UK that it's a very kind of like in many other areas that we have, the nature writing genre is very, very uniform in terms of who writes. So I suppose Forestry England, because they did a project like this, they were trying to find other voices, because I would say it's not that they aren't Black and brown people who are doing nature writing, it's just that we don't have the kind of we don't have the voice, or our voice isn't heard. I don't like to say that people don't have a voice. I think quite often we're not listening to them and we're not giving people the spaces to speak. So for me, that's what happened there. I kind of was pushed onto the scene, like with nothing behind it. And I didn't grow up in England, so I also didn't know kind of the weight that Forestry England had, and I didn't have anyone, excuse me, to tell me. Like there were no Black nature writers that I could go and dig up and find easily. Now that I'm kind of a part of this sector, there are many, many people around. They just haven't been given the kind of same resources and attention that I have through this scheme that I came up through. And I mean, it is not, and I think everyone has said it before, it's definitely not that Black and brown people in the UK and in the global South themselves are not involved with issues of climate change, sustainability, all these issues, because the thing is, where people live, I grew up in Jamaica, you kind of are, you have sustainable thoughts by just out of necessity. You kind of right, you live and you upcycle, you recycle, you pass things from one child to the next, because that's just how we grew up. So I think the discussion and the way how we talk about it has to be very different, because I keep being told like, oh, there are no Black and Asian nature writers, and that's definitely not the case. It's that the systems have been set up not for us, and they have no spaces for us. And I think until there's a project that comes along, like the one I was a part of, that says we are looking for, especially looking for Black women, whatever, and on all the advertising featured Black women, the interview panel featured a Black woman as well. So I myself saw myself and was less scared or less thinking I won't apply, I would never get it, they'd never look at me. And I think again, it's what we see and what we hear. and how we kind of are able to see ourselves within it.
Thank you, Zakiya. That's very positive, and I think I like what you say about the fact that it's not a lack of. It's just that the visibility is often not. We don't make ourselves visible, but also it's because even if we do make ourselves visible, we are having to deal with decolonizing of spaces, even in museums, even in the forestry. You know, all of those spaces have been colonized in such a way that we don't feel as though we can identify with those spaces. So we don't naturally want to associate ourselves with that, because that is all part of this psyche thing. So as we move on to the next session, I want to invite Donna, who is my co-host, to have the next set of conversation. Donna is also part of, she heads a group called Tantidi Folk Group, which is an incredibly powerful cultural singing group, which has been keeping Bristol going for a very long time, as well as her role within African Voices Forum. She's also a community activist, she's a campaigner, and she also likes to work very much behind the scenes. So today she's in the forefront. So Donna, I welcome you.
Thank you, Penina, and thank you, African Voices Forum and Bristol XR for having me participating in such a dynamic, very educational and informed series of events. And this evening, we are here with some powerful ladies sharing deep stories, widening the knowledge base of most of us who do not know much about the topics being discussed this evening. So we need to explore more. And I know that listeners, viewers would like to hear more about these very important topics. So I'm just going to go to Tess and in asking her, in your work experience, how do we translate the trauma caused by migrations to the view of society? Within the African context, we talk about harm, which can be transmitted from generation to generation, and the continuing impact this has on marginalized people.
Thank you, Donna. So intergenerational harm or trauma. I think this is quite interesting, as we don't actually talk about this in the UK, as you probably know. And I would say mainstream UK is just starting to learn about this now. And when we talk about it, it's really quite scientific, you know, in its lens. It's in terms of our DNA and our behavior. But it's not really about the human experience or the community experience. And for me, that really highlights our need to decolonize in the West, you know, to decolonize our minds and our worldview and what goes on in here, seriously. And how we understand and value, you know, our communities as well. So I think there's a lot to be learned about, you know, that way of thinking by itself. So with refugees, in the refugee sector, some people talk about 3 traumas. So that is the reason, firstly, that someone had to flee, whatever that is. Secondly, the second trauma would be their journey to the UK, you know, and this, of course, often includes a lot of abuse and a lot of very traumatic experiences, from forced labour to sexual abuse. 2/3 of refugee women are sexually abused on their journey to the UK. I've met young men who've had to sell their body to make money to continue their journey. There's a lot of fear, insecurity, hunger, death en route of your family or other people traveling with you, or even being caught in the way, you know, by smugglers, traffickers, I should say, or in detention centres. And then lastly, the trauma they experienced in the UK, which adds to these 2 secondary traumas, or these second traumas, which they're subjected to within the asylum system or the immigration system. And that is the racism that they receive at an institutional level, and with people in their everyday lives, and in some cases, many cases, too many cases as well, the culture of disbelief by the Home Office, the dehumanization and the uncertainty and the limbo about their future and safety when they're waiting for the asylum claim to come through. And of course, the living conditions that many of us get through the poverty they're forced into through the asylum system, as well as many migrants who get visas as well. And on top of this, of course, there's, you know, just loneliness and isolation and perhaps lack of a community. And this buries, this isolation means mental health issues are buried further. But what we do see is very high levels of PTSD, of course, and anxiety and everything that comes with that, you know, flashbacks, sleeplessness, fear, stress, often huge anxiety in busy places. So you might even have drop-in that's accessible for asylum seekers, but people are too scared to go there. It's too intense for them. And of course, this, you know, this can go on for years as people are stuck in the asylum system for years. You know, I've met people that have been stuck in the asylum system literally for decades. And even after that, when they're granted status. So mental health and that this kind of trauma is a huge thing. I would say is massively overlooked. People try to cater for people's basic needs, but it's a huge thing that's lacking in the refugee and asylum seeker sector. And I wouldn't say it's a fault of the sector. Obviously, capacities are really low as a whole, and they are just trying to, you know, keep those basic survival things, keep people in the country, and so on. And I think the trauma of the reason people need to flee and their journey here and the situation in the UK, this is the trauma that's the closest thing to them. And these acute anxieties, you know, PTSD and so on, are a reaction to that more immediate trauma. And the larger intergenerational trauma of the violence involved in colonization is not the thing that's most acutely at the surface, I would say. But I think this is deeper intergeneration trauma. Our currents run at a far deeper level below the surface. And I've also kind of been wondering, if not everyone directly links the removal of homelands and colonization of culture, especially those that come further down the line of these direct imperialist impacts, you know, that might have happened to them second, third generation whilst they were living still and they're living in their native country. And they might not connect that and how deeply that cuts into you and your community. But I do feel like the generations of severance from the land and from your community, and, you know, essentially your purpose in life and your purpose in the cosmos, because that's really what these things are. This is really the safe hold that you know, this provides for you. I think this leaves profound wounds on individual and collective levels. And then those on the move who've experienced this colonialism and the pillaging and abuse of lands and people are then fleeing to countries who are the perpetrators of this destruction. And then they realize that these countries would prefer to see them die in the sea than accept them in the country. I think the trauma and the harm of this is unimaginable to me.
Thank you, Tess. That's given us a wide look into what really happens, you know, and leading on from that, Sophia, having worked in the school system, I know you have come across a lot of children who were migrant children, also children who were born to parents living in the UK who have faced some form of trauma. And I'd just like to know what kind of behavior are seen in these young people and what interventions can be effective in dealing with the harm, trauma that they exhibit.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Some of the types of behaviours that are seen in young people, and again, I'm going to say from a primary age going right the way up, are not wholly, but can be deemed to be like anxiety in primary, so low-level class disruption, self-harm, that is even within primary school children, low self-esteem, not just low level actually, so sometimes even some high-end behaviour within the classroom, sometimes behaviours that they wouldn't necessarily exhibit at home, but all kinds of things, because trauma can manifest itself in lots of ways. So it can even come out as anger, even in very young children. which could then easily, as I said, be misrepresented as just, you know, a bad attitude or whatever, without anybody looking at what the deeper cause is to that, what the root problem is to that. And then, so when dealing with some of these traumas and behaviours, sorry, the other thing I want to say as well, it's not just with primary school. When you then go up to secondary school and you have quite often a system of children and young people that may not be being heard, they may be being so on top of or even separate to those other things, subjected to racist bullying, explaining to teachers, not being heard, not being listened to, being stereotyped within that. So then that will again lead to anger and frustration, you know, and then when we look at young people when their minds are developing, how that will then manifest itself, you know, that could be some really deep hurt coming out as anger. One of the ways, so there's several ways of dealing with it. Lots of the interventions I've used personally would be things like teaching emotional intelligence, teaching young people, boys and girls, I'm just going to say young people, how to almost self-regulate, how to use their voice in the most powerful way without using anger behind it, knowing that even though that anger may well be justified, actually teaching them how to channel it in more of a way. I think that sometimes being contained within like a classroom or an indoor setting can be quite claustrophobic for young people. So to get them outside, to get them reconnected and relearning about nature, doing things that make them feel more leveled, if you like, and teaching them that their voices are valuable as well, and teaching them that actually to express and to talk and learn to talk. And sometimes young people have to learn to talk, because in a situation or in a society or a system where we are not listening to our young people, then obviously the next step would be to shout. So it's a lot of it is about relearning about ourselves, relearning, acknowledging their heritage and their history, and actually bringing that in, allowing them to talk and express themselves and putting value to their words and giving them the space to actually speak about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Sophia. And then Zakiya, do you see any barriers in trying to implement some of the solution within climate justice or the decolonizing of the education system agenda?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. So through the work that I have done with both as a writer with the Forestry Commission, which is more as an artist, and then as an activist through the Green and Black Project, you know, I think with the Green and Black Project specifically, or the Black and Green Project as we're now called, we were, you know, we quickly learned that we needed the interventions to fit the communities who we were dealing with. So our focus was so-called hard to reach communities and people who are seen to not engage with green issues. And again, I think from the very beginning, it was very clear to us that it is not that people aren't connecting with green issues, it is which ones are important to which group of people, why, and then how do you connect on those issues. So a lot of communities like ours, a lot of communities who are so-called hard to reach, there's a lot of research that is done, a lot of research. And quite often people from these communities no longer trust the researchers because they feel like there's so much that is extracted. Like with everything, they feel like there's a lot of extraction done and nothing is put back into the communities themselves. So I think the big thing for us throughout our project and throughout all the community work that I've done has been actually co-production. I think I'm very big on co-producing work with whoever is my participant. I believe researcher, participant, researcher, we blur the lines a lot, because especially working with young people, teenagers and children kind of from the age of 6 up, you know, they want to feel like they have some sort of control over something. And quite often, they, you know, we tell them what to do all the time. And they have the things that they like and they are involved with. And so we kind of had to find ways to let them feel comfortable with that. So I remember a particular example of a trip. So we used to, we take young people out to farms and wetlands, bird sanctuaries, and that type of thing. And we went on a trip. And usually when we're on these trips, we say no phones, we're connecting with nature, we're going to commune with the birds and the wildlife, no phones. Well, the moment you do that with kind of teenagers, they're just totally upset. They're miserable. They don't want to engage, that they don't want to do anything anymore, right? Because you just took away the one thing that means a lot to them. So for us, my co-ambassador, so Jasmine Ketiboa Foley and myself, we had to think about how is it then that we incorporate things that these people, these young people, our participants that we want to connect with and find out about them, how is it that we get them to do what we want to do while they also can do what they want to do? So we quickly, we found a way to do that. We said, okay, we're going to make an activity with your phones. This activity happens outdoors, so you're still doing the kind of interaction in and with nature, but we can teach another skill as well. So we brought in the phones, we started doing a little bit of nature photography. We taught a little bit of journalism, we taught a bit of presenting, so you could then use your phone and record an interview for your friend, and then we had a radio show that we would play some of this stuff on. So I think in that way, it is very much about listening to the people who you are working with and knowing that one size does not fit all, just as, in the education system or working with all types of vulnerable people, we know that situations are very specific. And yes, Bristol is very good, and we know Bristol is a city that is up on these things and up on, where everything, city of sanctuary, green city, green capital, all of that. But actually the whole, the diversity and inclusion of this city and listening to people from these communities is, I think, one of the things we can do a lot better here. And through that example, just one quick way how we did an intervention by listening. And these are young people now who, whenever we have events, they are always coming. The names are always at the top of the list because they got to do what they did. They learned something new. Everybody's happy.
Thank you so much. At this time, I just go back to my co-host, Ms. Penina, to continue into this further lovely discussion.
Oh, thank you. That was quite a rapid session. I mean, the thing is, time goes so quick when you're having a lot of fun. So I think with the time, we've got very limited time left. So I want to still engage with our speakers on a further subject before we move on to the question and answer session. By the way, if anybody has got any questions, please feel free to use any of the platforms that we are in. We'll be taking those questions in the next 15 minutes. So as we move on this conversation, I think we've heard from from that last session, things around trauma, the approach that can also be taken when we are actually encouraging people to take action against ecocide. But then, Tess, how do we shape action in the climate justice agenda that takes account of these experiences as a collective? Because I think that in this space, when I think about how sometimes if you're working in these spaces in smaller groups, sometimes it cannot be as effective as when you take collective action. So I'm just thinking about this. How do we shape action in those circumstances?
Thanks, Penina, again. So to begin with, I think there needs to be a fundamental understanding of climate justice within the climate actions movement across the board. I think at the minute it's often quite divided. People think that that these two issues, climate change and climate justice, are separate issues, and you can approach one or you can approach the other. You can approach climate change action, or you can promote climate change, climate justice. And generally it is obviously the people, Black and brown communities, that are promoting that. And many people, I would say, as a white person, white communities think, yes, that's really important to do, but maybe that's not the issue just now, because you cannot incorporate justice into this larger fight. We need to fight the oil companies, we need to fight the airlines or whatever, without understanding that this root cause of destruction of our lands and the dispensable feeling of lives all comes back to the same thing. And it's also denies the fact that suffering and deaths are happening right now due to climate change. So I think we need to be very careful to listen and to allow the stage to be given to the voices of those experiencing climate change right now, because the injustice is happening right now. You know, people are losing their lands already and their way of life, and they're suffering devastating climate impacts. I remember reading, this is quite a few years ago now, about 5 years ago, and it was an article, and it was based on about 5 years prior to that, of one of the only villages in the Andes that survived untouched the Spanish Inquisition. The last person had left that village because the glaciers had already dried up, you know? So this has been going on for a long time. So this is not a problem of our future. And I think that's, you know, the narrative of we're doing this for our children. I think that's a really damaging narrative, because why is it just for our children? What about the kids and the families that are already suffering? It's happening to families across the world as we speak, and we know Africa is particularly vulnerable with this. And it doesn't mean that you cannot mourn the future of your children, you know, it's not, I'm not saying that. We need to mourn all of our children's, you know, and all the children on this planet. There's no, we cannot keep up with this elitist, white supremacist, I would say, narrative, because this is the reason that we got here in the first place. And we don't include the voice of those who have been most impacted right now, and allow these voices to be subjected to this violence of colonialism and capitalism on the land for centuries, and ask them to lead and to set the standards and the needs and the demands, because they will really hold us, you know, to scale, because they're witnessing it. Then we risk not understanding both the real root causes and the scale of the problem. We risk missing that, and we risk thinking 2 degrees is okay, and it's okay for Black and brown people to keep on suffering and dying within this. And of course, many in Africa and other parts of the global majority know how to live sustainably as well. So there's so much wisdom that we're missing at the same time. You know, this is not a theoretical thing, they're already doing it. In much of Europe, we forgot how to do this centuries ago. So there's so much crucial learning. If we want to enter a more holistic, more healthy and more green space, why don't we go to the people who are already doing this, not the massive think tanks that we're spending billions of dollars on, or the research papers about geotechs, you know what I mean? This is going on right now. So there's so much we're missing out, and I suppose our and our ignorance, and even, you know, I dare to say arrogance. So I think allowing the voices of African people and people in the global south to lead the way, I think it will allow the West a much needed process of tapping into more indigenous ways of thinking. And, you know, of course, I'm not saying that we should adopt ways of thinking that are, you know, relevant to Africa, or, you know, to wherever else. But of course, you know, we've lost our ways of thinking here, you know, the Welsh, the Celts across Europe. And I think this dialogue with the global south and indigenous people can really awaken something in all of us, you know, a realization that the world has been colonized. There's countries in the world that are feeling it far more bluntly, far more violently, in far more deadly sense. But across the world, our minds have been colonized, our ways of being life have been colonized, our relationship with the land has been severed, our relationship with our community has been severed. You know, so many of us are talking about how nice it is to have this pause in lockdown, where I live in a very white working class part of South Bristol, and most people don't even know that you can walk up the hill 5 minutes away, because they've lost that relationship with the land. And I think having these dialogues with people in Africa and across the global south, we can move towards a greater resistance to global imperialism as well as climate change. You know, we start to do some deeper work in here as well. And with the securitization of states and the prioritizing of national security over human security and prosperity, there's a direct risk of creating a genocide of adaptivity skills, I suppose, in the face of adversity, because migration, of course, is one of the oldest adaptation and survival skills there's ever been. And it takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of creativity, it creates a lot of strength to leave your homeland, to go somewhere else, to survive into the unknown. I've never done that. I've lived in other countries, but I've never went knowing that I might never come back. It's a huge amount of a power from within. Mm-hmm. And denying people the right to move is denying people survival options. So, and with this, you know, we could see a genocide of many marginalized people in the global majority, including indigenous groups, including all kinds of groups. The world keeps warming at the rate it is. And I don't want to be overly doomsday about this, but we don't know how hot the world's going to get, or its impacts on the ability to humans to survive. I know parts of Africa, I read an article just about a week ago, are already reaching the theoretical threshold of what the possibility is to survive. When you have the heat levels mixed with high level humidity, we can no longer sweat. Or our sweat process doesn't work properly. And that's an essential process to survive in extreme heats. And parts of Africa, they've already started to see that in recent years, and they didn't think we'd get that to the end of the century. So the idea of trapping people in, and when we have a country that innately believes in free movement, is perilous and damaging beyond what I can imagine. So for me, there really needs to be a unification of global movements. And we of course, we're seeing this, and there just needs to be more energy poured into this, essentially.
Yeah, so I think just thinking about that energy, and you've also mentioned about relationships being severed due to the losses, and the wealth of information that has been ignored really from indigenous communities and going forward. Sophia, how do we then approach or encourage people to get more involved in the decolonizing agenda and also support young people more effectively?
I think the answer to that partly is in collective works, in that we are all accountable for our young people, not just biological parents. As a community and as beings, as human beings, we are responsible for the education and the social and emotional well-being of our young people. I think understanding our own individual power, particularly as mothers, fathers, caregivers, and also as recognizing our community power, recognizing that we hold that, becoming active and challenging policies and procedures within the education system, instead of just sitting back and just accepting that this is how it is, how maybe some of our parents or some of the young people's parents may well have done it. Just not accepting our lot, if you like. Kind of brings me back to everything that we've already spoken about, particularly within the education system, and also it brings me to the question where I think, like, does our education system need to be schooled itself and able to become more effective in delivering a more wider curriculum and a more inclusive curriculum?
Yeah.
I like the word inclusive, but that curriculum that covers everybody. And I think that we just need to get involved more in our schools. Quite often as parents and parents of children, Black children, and the only time we're called into school is when something bad has happened. And so we also, based on our own existing fears and experiences and negative and unfulfilled potential, possibly, I'm not saying it's a generalization, possibly would stop us from going into schools. We really do need to go in, not just schools, educational settings, and challenge. I think we need to support educating our young people within the community more, so more Saturday schools, that kind of thing, to skill up and empower our young people, but not just our young people, ourselves as well. So becoming knowledgeable, recognizing our power and using that power.
Yeah, I like the idea of being accountable to young people and also trying to understand our own individual power in challenging some of these institutions, which sometimes can feel so big. And sometimes when I think about our Africa and I think about all these developed nations that are often looking at it and trying to see what they can continue to extract from it, it reminds me of how the trauma that our young people go through. And Zakiya, in that space, what do you see as the barriers? I'm thinking that you're still very young compared to the rest of us here. So your school experience might still be quite fresh in your mind. Did you see any barriers whilst you're going through that education system? And if you had to say one thing that could have made your experience better, what could it be?
Well, I should say I didn't go through the education system here. So I went to school I was raised in Jamaica. I went to school in Jamaica. But I have a child who is in the school system here as well. And I have friends who are now or who were in the school system here and have told me about it. No, I think, you know, the big difference, the big privilege for me, having grown up in a country where we were, you know, the majority of it is Black. The teachers are Black, your lawyers, your doctors, everyone at the, you know, the professors at the university, everybody at the top of society, to the people who are cleaning the streets they all look like me and similar. So I think in a country like that, in the education system, whereas we do have problems, and the Caribbean education system, the Jamaican education system is still very colonial. It is still in the past. Like even Britain has moved further than that. But I think within the context of a country where, you know, majority Black, then there's never a thing where you think there's something you can't do, because you, again, it's this idea of representation. We see it. Everybody in every job looks like us, right? Compared to my friends and family who have gone to school here and what I'm now experiencing with my son here, I think, and you know, what my parents experienced when they were students here back in the 70s and 80s, you know, the things that would have pushed them to move back to Jamaica, you know, I think there isn't the cultural understanding. And I definitely don't expect teachers to have cultural understanding of every different culture, but I think there's a lot of cultural sensitivity that the education system just does not think about, does not care about, right? We're on lockdown now, but when I think about, you know, years before and some of the events that my son's school would have had during Ramadan, we're not Muslim, but I'm thinking about my son's friends who are. And, you know, those type of things that you don't even consider, that you would put a sports day during this time of the year, or, you know, an event that would mean that children from Muslim families cannot attend. I think the school system itself culturally just does not have any kind of awareness, and almost feels like they don't even care to think about other people who are coming into the schools and how we can better connect with them. You know, my child, unfortunately, he's 7, right? And he has already picked up that there are teachers, or there are instances where he will catch flack for no other reason that we can think of, right? Or no other reason that I can think of. And I mean, the very same thing has happened to me, as in I go into my son's school very regularly, but I'm a girl, like I would dress in a hoodie and tights, leggings at all points. And it is very, the way how the people in the school teach me, and it's an excellent school, but the way how the staff at the school treat me, once I was, you know, in the newspaper and they learn that I'm a writer, or she's a journalist, she's a PhD student, is very different now to how they treat all the other Black mothers. And again, I think it's this idea of cultural sensitivity and respect, right? Because I'm a single mother, so they don't expect a single mother to do anything but be on benefits. They don't expect me to be a PhD, to be studying to do a PhD. So I think a lot of what is happening in the schools is because there is little cultural understanding, or even again, it's this idea of voices, and some people not having the voices and not pulling people into it. So I don't think because we experience all the problems, we know how to solve all of them. And even if we do, we might not want to speak about them because we don't believe we have the platform, right? And I think one of the great things about this project that I keep talking about, the Black and Green project, is that everyone was on a level playing field. So we as the ambassadors, we very often found ourselves leading the meetings, leading all the discussions and making the decisions. And this is not usually how we have these organizations work. And it was entirely empowering, because we were told, we believe you, we believe your experience, it is valid, we believe what you say, and we will work with it. And I think within the education system, if there was more initiatives, because I do believe there are schools that are doing it and are trying, if there were more initiatives to kind of have a cultural understanding of different groups of people, how the education systems in certain countries are compared to here, I think we would have a lot. It would be easier for teachers. And again, I do not think the onus is on parents and students at all. I think the majority of the onus in terms of roping the students in, giving them a comfortable space, is with the institutions themselves. Parents, absolutely, we have to be there, because like I said, I know the difference in being active and not being active with my own son's education. But I think the institutions themselves have to change culturally, and it is up to us in groups like this to then put the pressure on them, right? I believe that we have to be putting pressure on them.
Great. The pressure. Yeah, I think about that. That's a really key point to make, actually. So actually, I really want to thank my panelists today. It's been really a really good conversation, but I'm not going to let you go off yet because I've got a few things which have come through, questions which have come through on the live stream as well as on the different platforms. And I'm going to maybe pick maybe 2 or 3, just maybe think about it, 2 minutes, quick response so that we can try and respond to a few of them. I'm going to first one, I'm going to give this to Sophia. Sophia, what do you feel are unique challenges to Black African and African heritage women compared to that of men and women from other ethnicities?
Sorry, didn't unmute.
Shall I repeat it?
Yes, please. Can you repeat the question?
So what do you feel are unique challenges to Black African and African heritage women compared to that of men and women from other ethnicities?
I think that there are so many, it would be hard to encapsulate all of them, but just to touch on maybe just a few unique challenges to African men and women. And I'll say compared to other, on this, I'm going to speak about that very loosely because obviously that, you know, I can't speak in totality. I can't tell you about any of it actually. But particularly for young men and young women, I think I'll take it back to, again, the misrepresentation of themselves, the lack of being able to express themselves, whether that is through the education system, through music, through art form, through just being recognized. I think that being allowed to just be without actually having to worry about, you know, whether we can, like Zakiya was saying, you know, in the playground with a hood up as a mum, that shouldn't be an issue. That shouldn't be an issue, but they are issues. I've come across similar issues in that I've had very, very harsh judgment from educators of my children, making assumptions about me as a Black single parent of 4 children. So they're the challenges. They're some of the challenges that we face. And again, you know, the challenges that Black men face or men of African descent face is that they're, you know, they're not very good fathers, for example. They don't work. They don't contribute to their families and their children. When that just simply is just not the case. It really, it's such a huge stereotype, but it's such a huge stereotype that just sits over so many things and actually prevents us, cripples us almost, stifles us and squeezes us to that we find it hard to then step outside of that. You know, we shouldn't have to explain why we're going to the shop, why we're dressed in a, you know, it doesn't matter what we're wearing, it doesn't matter what music we're listening to, it doesn't matter. I mean, I'll give you an example. My own son listens to music that I just don't understand. Not really. I've had to really sit down and really think about it, because actually, when I think back to my own childhood growing up, my parents didn't understand the music that I listened to. Turn it off, you know, don't want to listen to it, all of those things. But actually, it's an expression, and it's an expression of himself, like many young people, male and female, that they should be allowed to do. They have those challenges because actually that music is then deemed as aggressive, you know, their dress sense, the young women are over-sexualized, young girls are treated as young little women when they are like 6 and 7 years old. So they are some of the challenges, just to touch on very briefly.
Yeah, and actually there is another follow-up question which is very similar, but maybe this one I will direct it at Tess because just of the way it's framed. As a white mother and volunteer in a diverse community, how can I help to include and encourage mothers of color to bring their voices to more than a classroom party sign-up?
Hi, thanks for that. That is a difficult question indeed. And I think there's several reasons why it is hard. I mean, I know that there was parts of XR Bristol that actually spent a lot of time doing community outreach to Black neighbourhoods and streets, and Asian neighbourhoods and streets as well. And they would stand on the doorstep and they would have a conversation about climate change and environmental destruction. And these people they were talking to fully agreed, and they witnessed it and they saw what was going on. But the conversation didn't go further than that. They didn't come into the folds of XR as wanted. So I think there's a few questions around about that, or a few things to think of around about that. One, what movements are already going on, and I am going to talk about this in a climate change and environmental destruction sense, because obviously that's the framing of it, that are already going on by Black and Asian communities already. So I think we really need to remember that many people have been fighting for environmental justice, just because they don't have the same platform, or we're not seeing them on our platforms, does not mean they don't exist. There's some very powerful movements going on, and there's a lot of people putting their lives far more on the line than XR are right now. You know, I went to, I was arrested by the police, but I know I'm going to be let out a few hours later and I'm not going to be beaten. And there's of course people, environmental activists across Africa and South America comes to mind in particular, that are being killed for these actions. So, you know, there's different levels of putting yourself in the line, no doubt about it. So I think there's also a question of how we can support their communities. And I also think there is, as many of the women have already said so far tonight, you know, there are these voices out there. There's an idea that, you know, there's almost an idea in the kind of white British culture that British people, you know, are really diverse and engage in lots of different things, but Black and brown people, they only, you know, engage in things that we think they engage in. But there's, of course, that's not true. And there's lots of people doing stuff already out there. We just need to reach out to them, because the system has prevented those voices from being raised up. As I said, I am a trustee of a charity that deals with very marginalised women, trafficked women, asylum seekers, and refugees who are pregnant across Bristol. And we've really, we talk about these hard to reach communities, but they are where they are, and we are where we are, and we expect them to come to us to you know, to ask for help. And I think there's a big narrative around about that. So I think it's also making sure we're present in their communities and making relationships on those terms as well, just really readdressing how these relationships are thought about and how solidarity is thought about as well. And I know that's probably not a totally satisfying answer, because that doesn't give it, and you know, doesn't prescribe how to do that, but just recognizing the different ways to kind of perceive these challenges.
Okay. That's really good. I think that is a start. You know, I think thinking about how people perceive things. You know, we make a lot of assumptions about things just because we are not around those circles. And I think that that in itself can be a barrier, even in terms of just trying to build that solidarity. The final question is going to be one that I'm going to direct at Zakiya. Zakiya, can you explain more about the Black and Green Project and how one can get involved?
So the Black and Green Project is Bristol-based. We're a community-run program run out of Ujima Radio. So Ujima is a community-led radio station here. I am a volunteer, and the other ambassador was a volunteer. Our program actually ran in 2017. We were the first cohort. We were a pilot. We were called the Green and Black Project. Well, we've now got big funding from Big Lottery, give thanks, and we have been renamed the Black and Green Project, and we are going for the next 3 years. So over the next 3 years, we will have 3 ambassadors each year. We're just about to start recruiting. And again, you know, I can't say much of how this program will work, because it is very much led by who the ambassadors are and who is the manager of the project and the things that they are interested in. So for the year that Jazz and I were in, Jazz and I are both very arty. Jazz is a musician. I myself am a writer and into visual art. So we did a lot of visual art projects. We had photo voice projects, photo walks, we did nature writing, we did nature trips as a part of our kind of group of activities with young people. We had workshops on climate change. We had quite a few things, and they were all in the community based. And we spoke to people about what they wanted, what were the things that came up. And of course, in the area where I live and the area where Jazz and I lived at the time, air pollution was the big thing. So a lot of our work went on to air pollution. So so just to say quickly what the Green and Black Project is, again, it is about empowering and giving young people the leadership skills to do exactly what we're talking about, is to use the voice on these kind of platforms, because I am here now because of Green and Black and then the writers residency. But it is upskilling, so it's about upskilling young people and also extracting from them, and I don't mean extracting in a bad way, because it's an exchange. So it's so getting from them what works from them and then kind of building on it. So for me, again, it was I was volunteering at the radio station, but it was about building those interpersonal co-production skills that I might have been learning at university, but actually this was practically using it. And again, we're looking to do the same thing. This year, we're going to have 3 young people, and it is very much going to be on what they are interested in, but it's going to be very exciting. And I think we are, for what we've done in Bristol so far and how we got a conversation going, and now there are not very many green events that happen in Bristol before somebody thinks, wait, we don't have any non-white people on this panel. It doesn't happen in Bristol anymore. And I would think a lot of that is because we were just so loud. We weren't here to be nice, and we were very often seen as agitators and antagonizers, because we would ask the questions that we're asking here, actually. And we feel safe to speak about these topics here, but actually we would go into what was corporate or what was the institutions, and we would put our hands up and ask those questions. So we got a bit of a reputation as kind of not antagonistic, but definitely agitating to ask the questions that people didn't really want to ask about. How is XR going to do anything if it isn't looking at it, indigenous people from the global south, that type of thing. So you can go online and find us. So if you just search for the Bristol Green and Black Project, there's quite a lot of information online, and on my own website as well, which is just my name, zakiya.me. You'll find info there.
Thank you very much, Zakiya. That's very detailed, and it's really good to hear that work is going on. And I'm sure that between African Voices Forum, XR Bristol, XR RSN, we will probably be able to do more in this space to continue to really push this agenda. So as we come to almost the end, in the last few minutes, I want to welcome Donna to just give a very brief summary of the session, maybe just a 3-minute summary, Donna, and then we can invite Cabo to do a 2-minute closing spoken word before we close with Dravi John, just giving some thanks from African Voices Forum.
Okay, we're just struggling there. Just to say, well done to everyone today who have worked to make this session a very, very energetic, informative, and well presented session in my estimation. I could say today started off, the energy was boosted by Cabo, our spoken word artist, who just looked at life, also celebrated the goddesses in us all as women here today, and in seeking harmony and finding a balance. And that really kicked off the session for us. Today, we looked at environmental sustainability, decolonization of the education system. A brilliant overview was done on Afrikan Liberation Day, and as it relates to Pan-Afrikanism, empowerment, embracing. We looked at climate change as it affects land, migration and treatment, the abuse of migrants. We look also at agnomisy as it relates to the harm and the denial and the eye closing of the harm that still exists in our world and the effect it has on our people at large. And so much was covered today, and I would just like to briefly look at where our different panelists kind of cover areas, as Tess talked about continued control of African resources, the demonizing of migrants and the move to close borders in order to keep people out. Sophia mentioned the lack of representation, reflection, and relatable presence within schools that is often governed by a Eurocentric view, and why we need to decolonize by taking cultural perspective into account. Zakiya highlighted the lack of visibility of African heritage people within the conversation world. It is not that they are not there as writers, it is just that they don't get on the platform. As regards trauma, both Tess and Sophia hinted on some of the behaviors that can manifest and misrepresentation without taking account of the root problems. The stereotyping that leads to anger and frustration, and so on. Interventions such as teaching emotional intelligence, young girls using their voices, and channeling them on the right way. Zakiya spoke also further about the Black and green approach and why making connections through research might not always be effective. It's about getting people there, physically there, and getting them to understand and embrace what resonates with them to get better results. Today, I think the way forward is to, as Sophia said, to have more pressure groups like these kinds. Our voices need to be heard. We need to be looking at having more of these mini-series talking about subjects that we sometimes are afraid to talk about.
Yeah.
Yes, and helping our people, educating, continue to educate as we work toward decolonizing, as we work towards empowering, challenging, and most what came out today about border control was not about fighting to keep our people down, but about being activists in seeking the best for our immigrants. So today, again, let me say thank you all for such a lovely session, and looking forward for more. Once a month, maybe, we'll go for more topics. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Donna. That's a really great summary. And I think that I wanted to be able to thank everyone. I think that there will be some credits coming up in a minute, but as those credits come up, I'd like to invite Cabo to just give us the final word on this, some spoken word.
Hi, I can't start the video because it says the host. There we go. Thank you very much. Amazing. I feel honored to be a part of this process, and may what we share evolve. The piece I'm going to share now is called She Ain't No Dream. She ain't no dream, I'm telling you. Love's alive, breathing in front of me, beating hearts in the rhythm of love. I confess to her. Unconditional, every moan a prayer in honor of goddess on earth, knowing her worth. She ain't no dream, ever evolving being, in no need of no pedestal. The truth is in front of me. Feelings, emotions, thoughts stirred as storms are coming like tectonic plates rubbing up and down, clinging on for dear life. Rupture, washing away fear, pain, and doubt. Timeless in the fleeting motion, she nurtures as we collapse in contrast of a species at war with itself. Wounded beings, I seek the truth of all. She ain't no dream. The aroma and puddles are testament to it. One love as we embrace, seeking our own being. One love. She ain't no dream. So, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kabo. Thank you very, very much. Can I invite Dravi John to just finish off with a thank you from African Voices Forum? Thank you very much, Kabo.
Bless, give thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Right, okay, I'm just trying now to come on board. Can you unmute me?
You are unmuted.
Okay, right, and then put me on video, please, because... Right, thank you very much. Okay. Right, okay, right, I'm trying to bring myself up. Okay, greetings to you all. And thank you all very much. Today is the 57th anniversary of African Unity, initially OAU, Organization of African Unity. The day 57 years ago when our forefathers, people like Malemu Julius Nyerere, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, Mohamed Gaddafi, Robert Mugabe and others, we are brave enough, determined and wise to challenge the forces of the day. Indeed, they came together to stand and to bring African unity together. As the current chairman of AOU, African Unity, who is also the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, said, let Africa be the tree of life for vision, unity, freedom, and prosperity. I want to say to you all, today is also a special day for African Liberation Day, because Agenda 26, Resolution 2020 has been declared a decade of inclusive women in economic development, politics, education, and social justice. And part of that Article 6 also focuses on the development, empowerment, and achievement of all women all over the world and young people. But a glorious day for this African Liberation Day, the 57th year of AU. I want to thank Penina Kindman for coming up with this vision, the Anna Project, that have taken us throughout this month. And then, of course, all the other people that have been involved. But specifically today, you, the panelists, unique, you were fabulous. The exposition, the deliberation, wow. I want to thank you all. On behalf of the African Voices Forum Limited, I want to say thanks to our partners that have been involved. I want to say to you, Ndoma, togetherness, and Ubuntu, let us work together. Let us stand together. And as we say, today is a pleasant day for the African liberation. I thank you all once again on behalf of the African Voices Forum and all our partners. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dravi John. It was a shared vision, which was implemented by many of us. So I think I wouldn't take all the credit for that. I wanted to also thank Kofi Mawuli-Klu, because Kofi was actually the driver in the seat. So yeah, we were sort of, he set the agenda for us and we drove that vision. So I want to thank Kofi as well. Kofi, are you there? Did you want to say anything before we finally close off?
Just to say, fantastic. This is wonderful. And I'm glad that African people are demonstrating the power within, and we also have excellent allies to work with. So forward ever, we shall win. Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much. And also the people who have really enabled the hosting of this video, the hosting of this. I think there has been quite a few people. There's been Nathaniel, there's been Nick, there's been Ale. I just can't, you know, these things would never have happened without the support. Without the support that you've given it. And I just really want to express my very sincere gratitude to you all. We will probably have a session in 2 weeks' time when we have sort of had some chance to reflect. And we would really like to have a platform where we bring everybody together to look at a way forward, because this is not the end, this is almost the beginning of this movement. And we really want this movement to be involved in the movement of movements that drive not just the ideology of Pan-Afrikanism, but also takes a hold on the education agenda in terms of decolonizing and being active in that space, but also driving through the climate crisis and also how it relates to the global South by taking that solidarity approach, working with people who really want to work in the global North. So I want to thank you very much again and to close this session formally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we can carry on talking. The live stream is still recording?
Yeah. I don't know how to stop the live stream.